the best philosophy, when one succeeds, one gets a new understanding of something, often things that are very important to us, very large things like mind or consciousness or representation or knowledge. No other animal does this, and it seems to me that human beings, when they try to understand things, are doing something really quite special and wonderful. And when they succeed in understanding something different, for me, that's a very deep thrill.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Tyler Burge. He is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at UCLA. His work has covered a wide range of topics, especially in mind, language, and epistemology. His books include Truth, Thought, Reason, Foundations of Mind, Origins of Objectivity, Cognition Through Understanding, and his most recent book, which will be our topic for today, Perception, First Form of Mind. He also has a significant number of other published articles and book chapters, but with that, feel free to add anything. Welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Burge.
Thank you for taking an interest in my work.
Yes, I mean, it's my pleasure, and it's a real honor to have you on the channel here today. So, yeah, as I said, today's interview will focus on your book, Perception, First Form of Mind. And for the audience, it's available from Oxford University Press, and you can find it on Amazon and Google Books and plenty of other places where you can find books. I'll include some links in the description. And I have to say at the outset, it really is an impressive book, both in the scope and the detail and the material covered and the arguments made. Maybe a bit difficult to read at times. It's a difficult subject. But to some degree, I think that's unavoidable due to the complexity of the subject matter. So as a preliminary question then, who would you say is the target audience for this book, and how would you respond to someone who has concerns about the difficulty of reading it?
The main target of the book, I think, are philosophers and psychologists, particularly psychologists who are interested in perception. But I do hope that the book can make sense, at least in the large, to a wider audience. So the preface, introduction, conclusions, they're all written in a fairly non-technical style, and the more technical problems or discussion always involve an introduction of the technical terms, an attempt to explain them. But I think somebody just coming in off the street will have a hard time. I do think that philosophy does require a lot of patience. To understand anything well requires patience, but with philosophy, it's an abstract discipline. So you have to be willing to either be frustrated a bit, but get a sense for it, or be willing to give enough time to dig in. So I have to say, I think most of the best philosophy is not popular, not easily assimilated. But I've tried to give routes into this book that should be available to people who are not technically trained, not philosophically trained, not trained as psychologists.
Yeah, those are fair remarks. And like, while it may be difficult to, depending on your background, it can also be rewarding. I think I found it quite rewarding
I
to
hope
read.
so.
So yeah, um, yeah. So maybe if you want to, before getting into some of the details, I have a bunch of specific questions on things. Another kind of general question about the book. Do you mind describing? I mean, it's a book about perception, of course, but do you mind kind of describing your main central project here, what you're trying to, or what you've tried to accomplish with this book?
Yes, I'll try. There are two primary themes in the book. The first one is to try to describe the representational form of perception. Representational form is an analog of the form or grammar of sentences, or the logic of thought. Now, perception is not linguistic. It's not conveyed through sentences. I think it's not even conveyed through internal sentences. But like sentences, at least declarative sentences, it can be either correct or incorrect. The sentences are true or false. Perception can be accurate or inaccurate, and this is a fundamental fact about perception. Now, in the case of sentences, we have a rather highly developed account of their form and what we call their semantics. That is, a detailed account of what it is for them to be true or false. But although there is a very rich and powerful science of perception, there's no comparable account of what it is for perception to be accurate or inaccurate. So the first project in the book is to systematically use tools that I've acquired as a philosopher of language originally, to apply those tools to help us understand the analog of a grammar in perceptual states and the analog of a semantics. That is an account of what it is, systematic account of what it is for them to be accurate, inaccurate. Okay, so that's the first project. It's a kind of analog of semantics, or semantics and linguistics, or semantics and philosophy, applied to perception using tools, some of the tools that were originally developed for understanding language. The second main project of the book is to understand how perception fits in with a much broader picture of the mind. Let me back up just a minute. I think there are two primary features that make something mental or make something a mind. One is being conscious, or at least capable of being conscious. We're not conscious some of the time. We're asleep, but we're certainly capable of being conscious. And I think any individual that is capable of being conscious has a kind of mind. The other main feature that makes something a mind is to have states that represent the world. That is, states that are, as part of their sort of nature, they're capable of being accurate, inaccurate, true or false. So being capable of being accurate, inaccurate, as perception is, makes it a feature of mind. And I think it's possibly the most elementary feature of mind. We don't really know when consciousness emerged, but we do know when representation emerged in the course of evolution. It emerged with insects, and probably less than 500 million years ago, but on the order of 300 or 400 million years ago, very roughly. Earliest insects that were probably complex enough to have perception probably were on Earth about that time. Okay, so we know that representation, as embodied in perception, comes about pretty early. But how does perception relate to other mental capacities? In particular, how does it relate in us to thought? So we have these insects that have perception. That's a matter of science. I think given what perception is, we can know that the insects have it. We don't know where thought emerged. Maybe it emerged in the higher animals. Maybe it emerged only with us. Some of this depends on exactly what you mean by thought, of course. But traditionally, there's a distinction between perception and thought. And the second main project of the book is to outline a detailed account of the architecture of the mind, in particular, this part of the architecture. How does perception, which is a relatively primitive part of the mind, relate to thought or thinking or reasoning, which is a relatively complex, later developing part of the mind? Now, what's distinctive about my account is, first, that it rejects the idea that this is just a matter of degree, that a traditional view is that perception is concrete and thought is abstract. Well, that sounds good, and it's on to something, but it's not literally correct and is not all that useful. And second, often perception is characterized as what goes on in the mind in the here and now, and anything beyond that is conception or thought. Well, that also sounds pretty good. I mean, perception is clearly grounded in the here and now. We perceive things that are present to us. Of course, we've got to allow for distant stars that are long ways away. We can see them, but most of the things we see are fairly present to us and in the present. That is, they're not only close by, but we see them at the present time. But we have other mental capacities like memory, which take us to past times, and anticipation, which take us to future times. How do these capacities, which are not grounded in the here and now, as perception is, how do they relate to perception? Are they automatically types of thought or not? And my answer is that the idea that they are automatically types of thought is absolutely mistaken, that these capacities, like memory, come in levels. There's perceptual memory, then there's memory of thought, and that the perceptual level, perception itself, is a kind of center of a whole network of mental capacities, including perceptual memory, perceptual anticipation, perceptual imagination, perceptual learning, even perception-guided action. These types of capacities that we have, I think, are all at the perceptual level. So articulating this big picture where perception is at the center of a network of other capacities, some of which are not grounded in the here and now, but they're grounded in perception, is the and some distinction of how this network is different from thought or higher level capacities. Outlining that is the second main project of the book. So first project is to give a kind of account of what it is for perception to be accurate using traditional semantical tools. And the second project is to outline what I call lower representational mind, which has got perception at the center of it, but does not just consist of perception. That's a longish answer, but I think it gives an overview. Roughly, the first half of the book is devoted to the first project, and the second is to the second project. One other remark, both projects are thoroughly informed by understanding of the science of perception, which is a very powerful science. It's by far the richest, most powerful psychological science. We understand a lot more about perception than we do about reasoning, for example, from a scientific point of view. So another thing distinctive of my book is an attempt to ground both projects in what we know from perceptual science. This comes out especially in the second half of the book, but I try to make the whole book informed by what is known about perception from science, and not just perception, perceptual memory, perceptual anticipation, and so on.
Great. Yeah, that's a that's a great overview. Thanks. So much stuff that I want to jump into there. First, on that last remark, and this is definitely comes across in the book that you do take seriously a lot of the empirical work, the science surrounding cognition and perception, and you also are critical of approaches or people who kind of let the metaphysics and the armchair philosophy drive their theorizing, like more than like empirical or scientific work, or sometimes contrary to it.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to comment on that quickly, but
yeah, well, I think in general, philosophy should have learned that where science has something to say, philosophy should pay very close attention to it. I mean, much of the history of philosophy, we didn't have a science. Aristotle didn't have a science. He was trying to get a biology going and a physics going, but his biology and his physics are nothing like modern science. Descartes saw the beginnings of physics, but his physics was nothing like our physics. So right up to Kant, I would say, we didn't even have a physics remotely like our modern science, our modern physics. And Kant really understood Newtonian physics. But before Kant, nearly the whole history of philosophy was trying to work. Many of them were trying to be scientific and were being as scientific as was possible to be in their time. But much of what they constructed in theories about the world really really look, they're interesting because they were the products of very powerful minds, but they're not believable. So much of the philosophical theorizing by the great philosophers is not anything like knowledge, right? And I think one thing we've had to learn as philosophers is that philosophy has to have a certain humility on, especially on topics where science has something to say. And there are many topics that philosophy talks about that aren't informed by science. So moral philosophy, there's no science of morals. So I think moral philosophy should pay attention to psychology, because what's right, wrong depends partly on what one can intend and decide to do, and so on. So moral philosophy should make some use of psychology, but it's not fundamentally about the same topic as psychology is. It's about right and wrong, not how we work psychologically. But where philosophy is dealing with a topic where science has something to say, it seems to me a fundamental lesson that philosophy should have learned over the centuries is that it should be guided, at least initially, by what science has to tell us. Not to say that science is never wrong. Philosophy can engage with science and raise questions about it and so on. But by and large, history shows that where science and philosophy differ, science wins. So I think for me, it's a really basic lesson of modern work in philosophy that it follows science where it can. That doesn't mean agree with it in every respect. Sometimes philosophy has made very substantial contributions to the development of science, especially in the early stages of a science. That's what I'm trying to do in this case. Now, what's exciting to me about science in this case is that, as I said before, the science of perception, in particular visual perception, is the first rigorous, super impressive psychological science. When I was a young person and was first learning about philosophy, psychology was poo-pooed as a sort of, well, it's a baby science. It's not really, maybe it's not even really a science. It's just categorizing things, gathering data, and so on. There are no mathematically informed explanations. It's not rigorous. It's kind of a seat of the pants sort of thing. There was something to that in the 1950s, but in the 1970s, there developed the beginnings of partly because through the use of computers, which made experimenting on vision much more practical, because of the development of computers and because of some really fine intellectual work by first-rate scientists. Vision science, the science of how we see, developed very quickly into a powerful science that is very different from almost all of the rest of psychology. So what I'm, as a philosopher of mind, this is exciting to me because here I can ally with science and really hope to gain some solid knowledge, and maybe I can even dialogue with science in ways that can be beneficial for the science. Okay, so that's the background. Now, a lot of philosophy of perception still tries to do perception by, sitting down and thinking, well, what is experience like, and using your best philosophical analytical tools to understand experience, I think this is not a good method. It's not that it's worthless, but so much about experience depends on things that we can't get introspectively, just sitting in the armchair and thinking. You have to go out there and experiment. What causes the experience? How does it come about? And so on, to really understand it. But quite a number of philosophers, I think, still use the independent of science sort of method. This is changing. I think especially young people in philosophy of perception are beginning to take science quite seriously. But we're in a transition period. I think quite a number of philosophers now know they need to make some reference to science, but my experience is that most of them, even most of them make reference to science, don't really understand it very well. I'm sorry that sounds high-handed, but I believe it's true. It's not to say I'm the only one that understands it or anything like that. There are other philosophers whose work in this area I do respect and learn from. But just in terms of numbers, I think most of them are younger philosophers. So I think we're in the process of a change, which I think will be a good change for philosophy. But right now, I do think that quite a lot of what is said, even by respectable philosophers of perception, is literally worthless because it's not compatible with things we know from quite a well-established science.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I definitely agree with you there. Another way to think about it would be just we're trying to solve some issue. What are the different tools we have for approaching it? One of those is science and empirical investigation. It's a very powerful tool that we should be taking seriously. So
yeah, good. And philosophy of all things should use every tool at its disposal. And science is a very, very useful tool.
Yeah. So another thing that you remarked on in your initial description of the book, and also comes up in the book, is that you think that both consciousness and like representation or having representation they're each kind of sufficient for having a mind. And I was wondering, on some uses of the term mind, it's not so clear. And you remark on this in a note, I think, that people sometimes associate mind really closely with like consciousness, and sometimes the representation might be inessential to mind. What do you think about that? Is that mostly a terminological dispute, or something of theoretical significance, would you say?
Well, both, but I'm happy to say that if somebody wants to say the real core of mind for me is consciousness, and if you have if there were a robot that could perceive in the sense of meet the conditions, the scientific conditions we know of for perceiving, but that is not conscious, and somebody said, I wouldn't want to say that robot had a mind. I'm okay with that. I mean, I think I understand what you're saying. You're emphasizing the importance of consciousness. It really is an important feature. One thing I suggested is sometimes in the tradition, consciousness goes more with mind and representation goes more with psychology. But I tend to think this is a little bit in the area of a terminological matter. I do think they're both very central psychological properties. And as far as we know, I think either could occur without the other. I think we know that there's perception without consciousness in individual cases. I I see no reason why an unconscious being couldn't perceive. And vice versa, I think I could imagine an animal that is capable of feeling pain, have very, very rudimentary consciousness, but is not capable of perceiving or representing anything in my sense of representation. So I'm inclined to think they're in principle independent, sufficient conditions for having a mind or having a psychology, but we don't really know enough about consciousness to know whether they actually come apart in particular organisms or not. We do know quite a lot about representation by knowing a lot about perception. So I think we couldn't date even approximately where consciousness emerges in evolution, whereas we know that insects are capable of perceiving, and I think we don't know of any animals less complex than insects that they perceive. So rough there, that gives us at least some benchmark for understanding the advent of representation.
Right. And part of the idea there is that the like simpler things or other things would just lack the sort of complexity or sensory apparatuses or just capabilities that even things as simple as insects can have, perceptually speaking. That's what.
Yes. So, for example, it might be a very simple worm that has a nervous system, and maybe we could learn enough about consciousness to learn that that worm could feel pain. We can't tell. Just the fact that it wriggles and avoids something doesn't mean it's feeling pain. I mean, with us, we know we feel pain because we can just feel it and reason about it. And so on. You're looking at a worm, you can't tell. My guess is that worms don't feel pain. Really simple ones don't. I don't know about earthworms. So yeah. The idea is you might be able to have the apparatus capable of registering pain, but not the apparatus necessary to perceive the world, which we know quite a lot about.
Yeah. I did want to ask about some of the things you've said already made me think of some of your remarks on the language of thought hypotheses, mostly attributed to, well, most Jerry Fodor is most famously known for that, developing that sort of view. And you're pretty pessimistic about the motivation and use of that sort of hypothesis. I recall you saying already that there's like an analog maybe of language in thought and perception, but it's not really linguistic in the way that the language of thought hypothesis would require.
Yes.
I don't know. Do you want to comment on that briefly?
Yes. Well, the language of thought hypothesis is a very old one. Goes back to Occam at least to Occam in the Middle Ages, though Fodor developed it in a very sophisticated way. I'm not really pessimistic about there being a language of thought for certain parts of our psychology, for certain types of thinking. I suspect may work off an inner language. What I am pessimistic about is seeing anything like that in perception. I take it to be basic to at least Fodor's conception of a language of thought, that there be symbols in the mind or brain that can be identified as symbols and characterized as symbols independently of what they mean. We do that in the grammar. At least large parts of linguistic grammar can identify words as symbols and can give a theory about how they work in a grammar without paying any attention to what they mean, or at least many people think so. Chomsky thinks so. Fodor thought so. I'm ambivalent about even that, but let's just grant that. I take that to be a part of the language of thought hypothesis, that there be, it's certainly part of Fodor's hypothesis, that there be syntactical items or lexical items which can be identified in a science independently of their meaning. All right. So we really have three, you might say there are three factors when we're talking about language. There's the thing out there in the world that the symbol symbolizes. There's the symbol, and there's the meaning of the symbol. And part of what Fodor's hypothesis claims is that symbols in the mind can be identified and theorized about in a systematic way, independently of their meaning. Okay, so why am I pessimistic about this with perception? You might say, well, there's some elements of the brain that are operating like symbols. Well, there are certainly elements of the brain that are necessary for perception. You kill the brain, you'll kill any perception. And at least in the early parts of perception, early parts of the formation of perception, psychological states and neural states are fairly easy to correlate. But when you get deeper into the real part of perception where the meaning arises, the meaning seems to depend on so many parts of the brain that there's no simple correlation. That's first point. And second point is that the theorizing in perceptual science doesn't essentially rely on finding any parts of the brain that do correspond to the meanings, right? So the theory of the perception just takes the states to be meaningful to start with. They're identified as meaningful. So here's a perception of a shape. It represents something as a shape. So its meaning is got something about shape in it. The theory doesn't really correlate that state with any further symbol, anything that is independent of the meaning. We know that there's a brain activity going on underneath, but the theory of perception doesn't essentially make any use of reference to particular states of the brain that symbolize or carry the meaning. And of course, something has got to be there for there to be the meaning, but the idea that there's a systematic science of the symbols that underlie each meaning, for each meaning there's some symbol that is expressing the meaning. I don't think anything in the perceptual science suggests that we've got anything like that going, or that we'll have to get it in the long run. So I think this is a pie in the sky assumption that perception is like language in a way that science doesn't yet show us that it is like language in that way. even assuming that language uses symbols that are identified to be what they are independently of what their meaning is.
Yeah, very good. I did want to also talk about, I mean, kind of important in your book here is talk about information and informational states. And one distinction you draw early on regards um, information registration. That's a term phrase you use, and you say this is the initial or one definition you give here, which is that X registers information about Y if and only if X carries causally dependent information about Y, and X is carrying causally dependent information about Y is functional for X or for some system or individual that contains X. And so sensory modalities are informational in this way. And then on the other hand, you have representation construed more narrowly, construed as a distinctively psychological notion that can involve accuracy and inaccuracy, truth and falsehood, and conditions, and so on. Do you mind speaking a bit about this distinction and how
Yes.
important it is for your?
Okay, so let me just go over the information registration idea again. So X and Y there have to be a regular correlation between X and Y. So an example of X might be growth toward the sun and growth in a certain direction. And Y might be the sun shining from that direction, right? So there's a correlation between the way a plant grows and the direction of the sun. And it's causal. The sun causes the plant to grow in that direction, and the growth is functional. The growth by the plant in the direction of the sun helps the plant survive and reproduce because it improves photosynthesis in the plant. Okay, so that's information registration. Now, I think with perception, in every case of a perceptual state, the perceptual state informationally registers what the perceptual state is a perceptual state of. All right, so information registration occurs in a plant where there's no perception and occurs in animals where there is perception. What makes perception different is that it involves representation in a special sense. Now, there's a big caveat. Many people use the term representation, including good scientists, use the term representation as equivalent to information registration. Right? They say that the plant's states represent the direction of the sun. And that's fine as long as you're completely clear that here representation just means information registration, right? But there's another meaning of representation that's more restrictive than that meaning, and that's that the state is capable of accuracy or inaccuracy as a feature of its nature. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means it's not just a metaphor that it's accurate, inaccurate. It really is accurate, inaccurate. So we can certainly say that the plant's growth in the direction of the sun accurately represents the direction of the sun. You can say that if you want, but I believe that's a metaphor. It's not literally true Well, what would show that something that is literally true, that something is accurate or inaccurate, a state is accurate or inaccurate? I think you look to science and look to see whether scientific laws, especially causal laws, treat the state as accurate and inaccurate. Now, if you look at the laws of botany, the causal laws of botany, there'll be no discussion of accuracy or inaccuracy in any textbook on botany. You'll have some scientists talk about representation and say, well, that was accurate. But if you actually look at the laws that are the causal laws that are relied on in explanation in botany, I think you'll conclude, well, these states are not explained as being accurate and inaccurate. We don't need to bring in issues about accuracy and inaccuracy to explain photosynthesis and explain such things. But in vision science, the causal laws that are invoked in explaining vision bring in accuracy and inaccuracy. So by looking at the two sciences, the botany on the one hand and the vision science on the other, I conclude that talk about accuracy and inaccuracy with the plant is a metaphor. I mean, it's a harmless metaphor as long as you know it's a metaphor. What's really going on is information registration. So there's a longer story here, but that's the short story. I think it's literally true that insects have states that are accurate or inaccurate, and it's not literally true that bacteria or plants have states that are accurate or inaccurate. It's also literally true that jellyfish and worms informationally register the world and function to correlate with the world in a certain way. And you can say metaphorically they represent the world, but it's not literally true that they have states that are accurate or inaccurate. And the ground for that, again, just to repeat, is the laws of how they work don't bring in anything about accuracy and inaccuracy in the case of the bacteria and the plants, but do in the case of human beings and the mammals and down to the insects when we're dealing with perception.
Yeah, very good. I was thinking, part of the point there is that our description of these other things that like the jellyfish or the plant, you could use words like, oh, the representation, accuracy, inaccuracy, but it's illimitable, right? We don't need, it's not essential to our like scientific description of those things, whereas it is in our kind of adequate theories of other things, adequate descriptions of other things like us and other representational systems and creatures. That's
Yes, good. I think you're really enunciating a really basic principle of science, which also came from Occam. It's called Occam's razor. I mean, it's often misunderstood, all that, but the simple idea is in giving a scientific explanation, don't bring in more complex apparatus in giving the explanation than you have to. You give the simplest explanation, most basic explanation you can without invoking further matters. It's the reason why we say, look, there's no invisible, weightless elf riding down on the top of bodies that are falling, right? And it helps them fall, right? Adding in the elf under the theory of gravity adds nothing to the explanation. Well, here it's something similar. It's not as silly, but adding the idea that the plants represented are accurate about the sun adds nothing to the explanation of how the plants work. but it adds quite a lot to the explanation of how certain animals work. Good. So the basic idea that I was going to add on, but you very, very astutely added on yourself, is that, science doesn't bring in more ideas to carry out its explanations than it has to. It tries to give the simplest, sleekest explanation of what goes on that it can, compatible with the evidence.
Right. I just, one potential concern that I had, though, was that what if the future science kind of changes and talk about inaccuracy or accuracy of creatures like us does become sort of redundant? We have a more reductionist account of that. I mean, do you think that that's probably not going to happen, and that really this is a distinct thing that won't admit to that sort of analysis? Or you just say, well, this is just the best theory we have right now, and how would you comment on that?
I think we want to distinguish two things here. One is what you might call eliminationism, and the other is reductionism. With the plants, I think we can eliminate, at least right now. We may learn more about plants and realize, they do have representational states. I doubt it, but it's always open. Science can always change and deepen its understanding of the world. But your concern is about mental states. It's a frequently discussed issue at least 30 or 40 years ago in philosophy. Are we going to find that talk about accuracy and inaccuracy and truth and falsity and states that have those properties? Are we going to find out later that science doesn't need? It's like talking about witchcraft. So talking about the elf riding the rock down when it's falling, or it's like talking about the plant having beliefs and desires or perceptions. We tend to think that's not right. Maybe one day, with this idea, we'll find that talk about accuracy and inaccuracy and truth and falsity is not right either. Okay? So I think in principle, this is possible. However, first, mere reduction doesn't show that's true. When you reduce one theory to another, you've really shown that the first theory was true, but it's just another way of saying what the second theory, the reducing theory, says. They're both true. So if a reduction were to occur, I don't think we could conclude there are no accurate states. We would just say there's a more fundamental way of talking about the accurate states, the mental states, all right? Okay, so that's different from eliminationism, which would say, well, there are no minds. This view would say something like, well, they're minds, but it turns out that minds are just actions of the brain, operations in the brain. That's all there is to it. However, although I think reduction and elimination are in principle possible because science is always open, I think it's vanishingly unlikely that either one of them will occur. Why? Well, the eliminationism was really based on the idea of psychology really isn't a science. It's this baby science and all that. That has gone down the tubes. We know now that rigorous, powerful science is describing the mind in mentalistic terms, in representational terms. Okay, so I think eliminationism is now virtually eliminated. I mean, in principle, it could come back, but science doesn't have a way of just giving up on really going scientific enterprises as this enterprise now is and has been for 50 years. It's going strong and it seems to be accelerating. Reduction, I think, is a kind of facile way of thinking about science. I think true reductions don't occur very often in science. They do occur, but not very often. I don't think there's the slightest reason to believe that the talk of representation will be eliminated in favor of some other, not eliminated, but replaced in better talk. I think, in fact, the brain science and the psychological science will keep chugging as they are, and their relations will be made more and more complex and better understood. But I don't see any reason to worry about the whole of vision science being reduced to some other science. So, in principle, it could happen, but I think it's like worrying about something that's extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely. If you worry.
Yeah, very good.
Right.
Yeah. on the reductionism and eliminativism, I like to think that's a good point. The advent of modern chemistry didn't eliminate water, for example. It's just we had another theory or apparatus for talking about the same thing and perhaps more basic or smaller components. And yeah, I was thinking.
Point about the reductionism.
Yeah.
The accuracy and inaccuracy talk tells us something we really want to know. We really want to know how we see the world. And seeing the world is a matter that can be accurate or inaccurate. Seeing is an accurate representation of the world. And now, just studying the brain, I don't see how you're going to really tell us how this connects to the world. I mean, in the rep and in such a way as to be seeing. In principle, maybe there's a reduction, but the shape of the sciences look too different to me. The one is concerned with how these circuits work inside the brain, and the other is about how the mind connects to something well beyond it, things we see out there. So the sciences don't seem to lie very perfectly on one another in the way that, say, water lies on H2O, right? If you understand the composition of water, you've understood all there is to it. But by understanding the composition of the brain, you're not understanding all there is to seeing. Seeing is connecting to something out there.
Yeah, very good. I like this reminded me of last year I had an interview with Professor David Papineau, and we discussed his book, The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience. And as I recall, the main his approach the main idea to his approach is that perceptual states are phenomenal states that are contingently representational or perceptual, and they're representational or perceptual because of certain developed correlations and facts about biological teleology. Absent those features, the relevant phenomenal states would not count as perceptual or representational.
Yes. I agree with some of that. I don't believe that perceptions are phenomenal states. I think there are tons of perceptions that are unconscious and not phenomenal at all. So I think that view of Papineau's is evidence that he hadn't thought very hard about the science of perception. And the idea that um, the connection to the outer world is contingent to the state also, I think, doesn't connect very well with the science. I think the science takes the basic properties of these states to be representational, not to be phenomenal. So here's a little bit of evidence of what I was referring to earlier. I think Papineau is a scientifically interested philosopher, especially interested in biology, but I don't believe that at least those remarks don't show any particular grip on actual vision science or perceptual science.
Interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, because the way you want to think about perceptual states, it's like, first of all, you could have perceptual states even in principle without being conscious, right?
Yes.
And even if you are conscious, some of your perceptual states may be partly or wholly unconscious as well.
Yes, good.
So, right.
I think that's a very important point.
That's just going to follow from, well, what perception is and like certain facts about, like empirical facts about perceptual creatures and systems.
Yes.
Is one way to put it.
Maybe. Yes, it's definitely empirical that there are unconscious perceptual states. That doesn't follow from the nature of perception, but it does. I mean, it is a widely appreciated empirical fact in the science.
I think, though, he also does want to develop a view here which is going to ultimately be consistent with, reductionist views, or at least, physicalist views, regardless of what you think about reduction. I don't know. What do you think about that? Or would you consider your view about mind kind of physicalist, even if not reductionist? Or is that not a kind of description you care that much about?
Yeah. I understand physicalism really to be a kind of reductionism, but maybe you mean materialist view. That is, perceptual states are ultimately material or something like that. I find these mind-body views, I'm interested in them, but I don't think science supports any one of them very strongly. I mean, I think this much can be said, that the perception absolutely can't work without a brain or without some physical operation underlying it. So at least Cartesian dualism, which says, well, you can separate the mental, at least the perceptual mental, from the physical. I think that's not possible. So to that extent, I'm on the side of the materialist, but I'm doubtful that there's any literal sense in which the states are made out of material. I just don't see that the made out of, or the compositional relation, which is so important to chemistry, is much of a factor in this particular psychological science. So I think I'm kind of agnostic about this. At least my official position is to be kind of agnostic. I tend to say, look, don't worry about these issues unless the science tells you to. Well, you can worry about them, but you better be pretty modest in your worries. Whatever view you take, it would be good to be modest about it and not too ideological, because it looks to me as if science it's definitely committed to the connection between perception and the brain. No question about that. But the idea of exactly what the relationship is perceptual state made out of the material, or is it realized in the material? What do these notions mean? I think like be a good idea to keep an eye on all this, but not get too deeply committed.
Yeah, I think that's very, very fair, and at least for the purpose of this book, I mean, you're not forced to take a side here, right?
That's right. Yeah,
for the theories you're trying to develop.
that's right. Yeah,
So
willing to take
leave that for something else.
Cartesian dualism, but otherwise, and I'm willing to take a side against reductionism. I think it's unreasonable at this stage to believe that there'll be a reduction. It's not unreasonable to think it might, in principle, be a reduction, but any confidence that there be a reduction, I think, is quite unreasonable. But beyond that, and the same point about eliminationism, I think that's even more unreasonable. But anything beyond those ruling out those extreme views, I think I'm pretty neutral about it, at least as far as the book is concerned.
Yeah, very good. So a few more things I wanted to cover. So this has to do with I'm a kind of fan of a lot of issues having to do with vagueness, and I was like reading some of this. I was wondering how sharp would you say is the boundary between information registration and things which are not information registration? And this question also applies to other things like perception and non-perception, representation and non-representation, because that my thought was that, look, these things can carry more or less information. They can be
Good.
Uh, weaker or
stronger
causal correlations,
yep.
And so on, right? So, I mean, would you think of information registration in this way as like degreed or vague or not? How would you think about that?
Yes, I tend to think that vagueness is all over everywhere. So even in mathematics, I think there are elements of vagueness. So, however, science makes progress not by just throwing up its hands and saying, well, it's fuzzy, all that is all a matter of degree. Science makes progress by finding at least rough cuts in the world. They're not sharp, they're fuzzy, but they're boundaries. The boundaries are fuzzy, but they're kinds. And causal explanation does work off those rough kinds. So, yeah, I want to say information registration, it's built in. It just says there's a significant correlation between X and Y. Well, what counts as significant, right? Well, some are useful for science. Some correlations would be too weak to be of any interest. And then we just have to get in there and look in particular cases to see what kinds of correlations are scientifically valuable and lead somewhere. Yeah, so I think the same. I haven't found any cases which are, I'm convinced, of fuzzy cases, whether it's a perception or merely information registration. But I don't doubt there are going to be such cases. So I think your idea of vagueness is out there. I think it's pretty much pervasive. The world is so complicated that you can't get really sharp packages and cuts, but it also allows us to get rough, fuzzy packages that we can do explanation on.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, I think you were talking earlier about how insects, or at least many insects, have a sort of perception. But look, I mean, they have some ancestry, and some of their ancestors are even simpler. And eventually, you get to a point where, okay, that definitely doesn't have, in the middle, it's probably gradual and probably not, I would think, a sharp cut to, okay, now it has perception, But the fact that those vague boundaries doesn't undermine, to any significant degree, the scientific and philosophical relevance of this theorizing.
That's
I
right.
would say, is that what you're saying?
Good. I think that's just right, and I don't have any objection to thinking about it that way.
Yeah, good. And another kind of general philosophical issue that came up for me, I can copy this as well, which you later discuss. Again, you discuss, it's quite comprehensive, is causation, and you describe perception and even information registration in partly causal terms. And I mean, I worry that causation is a bit tricky, and sometimes when it's assumed for some philosophical or otherwise scientific theorizing, without being also a target of that theorizing, it can sometimes, well, I have concerns about what even causation is, what it's supposed to be capturing. People have wildly different theories, and a theory that relies on that notion might be a bit obscure or problematic in that respect. Now, you recognize some of the issues there and discuss causation a little bit, especially later in the book. I think that's in the chapter 12. So anyway, I won't keep rambling. What would you say about this, and especially to people who are kind of skeptics of causation?
Yeah, well, I want to know what they're going to put in its place. I don't use very much about specifics about causation in the book. I do rely on these points that causal relation is fundamentally a relationship between concrete particulars. It's not a relationship between abstractions. And I think that perception is causally related to what's perceived, literally what's perceived in that implies for me the key point is that perception is fundamentally of localized particulars in space and time. I think that much is fairly obvious. I also need a distinction between causal explanation and functional explanation. But exactly what that comes to, other than, I mean, you can give examples of each, very clear examples of one and the other, but then to try to give an explanation about what causation really is, I don't think I need to do that. So I'm willing to listen to somebody who is nervous about talk about causation. I would be a little concerned if somebody just thought there was no such thing. It's just a complete mistake to think there's any causation in the world. But I want to know. Tell me what you mean by that, and let's see whether I can accommodate it. I do find theories of causation mostly pretty unsatisfying. The famous theories, counterfactual theories, for example, I don't find they don't explain what I mean by causation. They're connected to important features of what I mean by causation. But yeah, so I'm to some extent willing to think of causation as a bit of a placeholder. It's got to do those things. whatever counts as causation, it's got to be primarily and fundamentally between particulars, not abstractions. Causation occurs in time. It's not a timeless matter. Causal laws may be timeless, but the causation itself isn't. And I need a distinction between causal explanation and functional explanation, but exactly what that comes to when you get down to the metaphysics of causation is again something I don't think I have to worry about too much.
Yeah, yeah, good. I was. What do you think about the if someone were to offer as a substitute for causation, maybe some facts about law-like correlations or something like that between things, and dispense with talk? Could that do much of the work, or do you think that's still missing something?
Well, there could be
causation.
functional laws that are correlate. So I feel like that's not quite enough. It's got to be a certain kind of law. But I mean, I don't insist on. I mean, I'm comfortable with calling it a causal law, but I'm very, very aware of the fact that we don't understand exactly what causation is. I do think there's a distinction between statistical or indeterministic sciences that are based fundamentally on statistical correlations, as quantum mechanics possibly is, seems to be, and explanations like, in geology or biochemistry. But as long as one preserves the cases, the difference between cases, I'm again fairly willing to be open-ended about what to call it.
Yeah, fair enough. Another significant philosophical topic I think that comes up in your work here is on properties and on tropes. And you say that property tropes they're perceptually attributed and perceived. Things have tropes. Those are instances of some kind or universal, something like that. Now, for me, so I lean towards more nominalist views, and it's not. Maybe I'm not so clear on what tropes even are, or what the theoretical benefit, like positing them, offers. So, in the case of, take some token case of reflectance, for example, where what sense is there in positing a reflectance trope, rather than just saying that, well, there's light, traveled a certain path toward and then away from the surface, intersecting it in the interim. Why do I need to say, and there's like the reflectance trope there? Or are you saying that's just what it is to have the reflectance trope, for the light to bounce off it in that way? I don't know if that was clear, but do you see what I'm saying?
The way is the property, but the particular bouncing in a particular case is the trope. It's the reflectance in the particular condition in front of you, which shares that reflectance perhaps with some other surface, right? So the person that denies the trope says there's only the surface there, not the particular condition of the surface. which is the instance of the reflectance, I don't find that very plausible unless you're sort of working entirely from the armchair. If you're thinking about thinking scientifically about what's going on, you think, well, that reflectance could be repeated again. That way of reflecting at that particular level of reflectance on some spectrum, that's the property. But that property is instantiated by a particular condition of the surface at a particular time. And we shouldn't deny the existence of that condition. I mean, in a way, the trope is more nominalistic than the reflectance type, right? The type is somewhat abstract. You can't localize reflectance R, right? It's all over the place. I mean, it's been in the past and been in the future and so on. There's no point to asking where it is. But you can ask where the particular condition or instance or case of that reflectance is. And well, it's right there at that surface. I want to take that literally. So actually, I think the trope is more on the nominalist side of things, and the repeatable property is more on the abstracting side of things. I think we need the abstractions too. I mean, science talks about reflectance in general and gives a theory about it. Some philosophers try to parse that away, but all right, that's metaphysics, which I think somewhat is struggling with the science. The science seems to be pretty straightforward in allowing both. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. It does. I guess maybe I'd have to think about it a bit more, but I guess for these cases, like, yeah, light is hitting the surface and then continues away from it, and we can describe in more detail what's going on there, what the various composition of the surface, the sort of arrangement, the wavelengths of the light, and all these other things. Some of these descriptions we might subsume under more general physical laws. And if somewhere in that description I've just like mentioned the trope in some other words, then I guess I would be fine with that. My only concern is that no, there's all that goes on and we might describe in those ways, but there's also the trope. That is a bit unclear to me. I don't know if I've been super clear.
The trope just is the structure of that particular body, the condition of that particular body that produces the light, and the light shines on it. Nothing more than that.
Okay, great. Then yeah, I guess I had potentially misunderstood, but yeah, I'm good with that then. Yeah. I did want to. There's some other things that we could cover, but we're coming closer to the end, so a couple of questions, then we'll wrap up. I do want to talk about some of the things that you took to be, or well, not just that you took to be, but that are important to perception, and some of the different capacities that we have. And one of those is perceptual constancy that you talk about at some length. So it's one of the key perceptual capacities that we have.
Capacity to represent a given, let's say, attribute, say a given color or reflectance. Despite great differences in the proximal stimulation. The proximal stimulation is the effect of the color or the reflectance on the eyes, all right? So just to give an example, insects can track the color red, some of them, even if you shine blue light on the red surface, right? What comes into their eyes is a combination of the blue light and the red type reflectance. What's distinctive about perception is, despite the difference between shining white light on the red surface and blue light on the red surface, where the stimulation will be very different in the two cases. You can get it phenomenally. The surface will look very different in the two cases, right? But in both cases, both we and the insect can respond to that surface as red, right? So what is the capacity? Is the capacity to generate many different states, each stimulated by a different type of proximal stimulation, but all of them responding to the same environmental property, even though the effect of the property on the eyes differs in each state from one to another. So when you find that phenomenon of a whole range of states which derive from very different proximal stimulation, the immediate stimulation on the eyes, but they all come from the same property out there, and the organism can respond to that property in the same way despite those different stimulations, then you've got evidence for the capacity for, which is a perceptual constancy. I think perceptual constancy is the key property that marks perception off from information registration. That's a philosophical conjecture, but I don't believe it's been defeated. I've had it around for 10 years now, and I've tried it on scientists and philosophers and so on. People have objected, but I feel like I've been able to respond to all the objections. That's what that long chapter is partly about, both illustrating perceptual constancy and responding to objections, maintaining, you can have perception without perceptual constancy, or in some cases, you can have perceptual constancy but not perception. I don't think either type of objection ever works. So I'm pretty confident, I'm not supremely confident, pretty confident that perceptual constancy is the most important mark of perception. That's how insects were determined to have perceptual states. You could check them with those colors and put all kinds of funny light on them and see whether the insect still went to the red color, where we know independently it needs to get to the red color in order to pollinate. It's its favorite color and so on. Then you can test it to see whether it can do this. If it can, you've got pretty good evidence it's got perceptual constancy, and then that's the mark of perception. Same thing with size, just for your audience, same thing for size and shape. You can have a size really close up, then the type of stimulation would be very different from the size a long way away. But animals can respond to that same size, whether the size is close up or farther away. And same with shape. The circular shape of a plate hits your receptors one way when it's straight on and another way when it's slanted. It's more elliptical when it comes at, the impression is more elliptical when it's slanted than when it's straight on. But we and various animals can determine that shape to be circular, whether it's slanted or not. All those examples of perceptual constancy.
Yeah. One of those sort of objections that you mentioned there was that someone might think that you could have perceptual constancy without perception. Now, I know philosophers will defend just about anything, but that seems really strange to me. That seems almost
Yeah, of course, they
incoherent.
describe perceptual constancy. They would say, well, then it's not strictly perceptual, but um, there are lots of ways to go wrong here. I don't want to spend time on that, though.
Yeah, fair enough. So, I mean, this has been really great. I feel like we've covered a lot, but at the same time, we've kind of only scratched the surface of the stuff that's in this book. It's quite dense and comprehensive.
Thank
And
you. I
I
think
do,
you're very well informed for having just read it recently. I can see you've done work on philosophy before.
thanks.
I appreciate the sophistication of your questions.
Great. So I do like to close out with a general philosophical question. I guess it's sort of a metaphilosophical question, which is that, well, what do you think about the value of philosophy? Why do you find philosophy worth doing for you, and I guess for society? What do you think is good about philosophy?
Well, let me preface it by saying what I think is hard and maybe in a way bad about philosophy. I think there's a lot of strong opinions in philosophy by very smart people that are not very well grounded. So I've felt in a way sort of sad that I like to think of philosophy as trying to gain knowledge, but I think a lot of what's out there is very intelligent and clever bullshit. um, Not intended as bullshit frequently. Sometimes it is. I know philosophers that don't believe what they're maintaining, they don't even believe it. Uh, but unlike science, philosophy is not grounded in evidence and standardized methods, and that makes it much harder to uh, do good work and to gain knowledge. All right, so what do I do? Two questions. What do I value about it in my trying to do it? And why do I think it's valuable for lots of people, including people that don't want to be professional philosophers? Um, for me, it's valuable because I think the best philosophy, when one succeeds, one gets a new understanding of something. And often things that are very important to us, very large things like mind or consciousness or representation or knowledge. Um, no other animal does this. And it seems to me that human beings, when they try to understand things, are doing something really quite special and wonderful. And when they succeed in understanding something different, for me, that's a very deep thrill. And when I see it reading other philosophers, when I feel like this philosopher's really got something there and really taught me something deep and new, that's thrilling too. I don't think it happens very often. Right? Most philosophy is, doesn't achieve anything correct. Most of it's wrong. Most of it will pass away, and so on. But when it hits, I think there's something really special. It's like the specialness of really loving someone or being loved by someone in a deep, caring, not using the other person for some advantage kind of way. That's special and deep for me at any rate. So understanding is sort of like that. Why is it valuable for people that are not going to even try to get something new? Um, well, they can understand something that's new. So sometimes even if you're not a professional or whatever, if you're intelligent and follow it a little, you can get a sense, this is a little different. This is a little above the norm. I think I'm getting some understanding here I didn't have before. So you can participate in this thrilling matter of understanding something important in a new way. But even when one doesn't understand something new, philosophy has something to offer. I think that's why it's a cornerstone for undergraduate education. It teaches a kind of open-mindedness. It doesn't always exhibit the open-mindedness it should, but it brings out how complex the world is, and how, if you're going to be reasonable in this world, you need to be open-minded and realize there are going to be other points of view, and what you thought in the first place may not quite be right. You're not open to correcting your own views. Now, I think that's a really basic value in an educated person. And I think philosophy does teach that in probably as well or better than any other subject. It shows how complex things are. It shows, of course, sciences do that, but also shows how tenuous many of our opinions are and how we have to be ready to change them. Sciences don't show that quite as usefully as philosophy does. So I guess I'm a real believer in philosophy as a part of a liberal education, but I also think it's not just about learning to debate. It's striving for something really special. It's striving for a kind of understanding that, in a way, is always a little beyond what the sciences give us.
Very good. I love the way you put that. So yeah, I think we'll end the questions there. It's been really a pleasure and an honor to have you on here and give your time to answer some questions about this book. Again, links to that will be in the description. But yeah, thanks so much for taking my questions and giving your time. It's been great.
Thank you for your preparation and your engagement. I've enjoyed it.